So if we think about in this list, we've already come across set state. We know how to use that to control and manage local state really well. And that, of course, has to be used in conjunction with a stateful widget. But because stateful widgets are a lot more complex than stateless widgets, for one, stateful widgets actually need to have a memory. They need to remember what their state is so that it can be changed. Whereas stateless widgets are much more simple to work with and they just get created, destroyed, and rebuilt. Now, we also saw lifting state up earlier on using a combination of callbacks and lifting the state up in the widget tree, we were able to manage our state. But of course, as our app gets more complex and if we need to have callbacks that traverse the entire tree, or if we need our state to be passed multiple levels down, then we might encounter some problems. So currently, the most flexible way of managing state is through the use of the provider package. And this is currently the recommendation from the Google Flutter team for us to use. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that keep in mind that even though this is the officially recommended way of managing state in your Flutter apps, it's not the only way. And in a lot of cases, you might find you need a different way, or you might find that you need a combination of these different ways of managing state. And that's not wrong. It really depends on your use case, so your requirements, your particular sense of style for how you want to organize your code, and also the maturity of the framework of Flutter. But let's talk about Provider because it's a really, really great tool. It's a package that was actually created by the community. Google had a similar package called Provide, which did something kind of similar. But along came this guy, Remy, and he decided to build a version that was actually deemed to be better. So full credit to the Google Flutter team. They realized the potential of this package and actually put their full weight behind it. And now not only is it officially recommended, but it's also supported both by Remy himself as well as the Google Flutter team. So that it has all the resources it needs to achieve its full potential. Now, in order to fully appreciate why Provider is so useful, we first have to consider what is the problem that it's actually trying to solve. So firstly, from our code, you might have already realized that there's a couple of things that's getting a little bit hairy, right? We have all of these callbacks in order to pass data back up the tree. And we have a whole bunch of stateful widgets, which needs to use setState to call the build method of the child widgets, and lots of things are getting rebuilt constantly. And it's probably not the most efficient way of going about this. But because our app is getting quite large and it's quite hard to see at a glance what's going on when we are managing our state, I've created a really simple app to be able to illustrate the problem a little bit better. So in this case, I have a top level class, which is my app, which then has two children, and one of which is something called level 1. And then level 1 creates another one called level 2, and level 2 creates level 3. So here's what that code looks like. It's pretty simple, and the important part is that we've got a MyApp class that creates a level 1 class that then creates a level 2 and level 3 class in that order. So here is our material app, which creates level 1, and then level 1 creates level 2, and level 2 creates level 3. So we basically have exactly this structure. Now, here's the problem. Let's say that I had a property that needed to be used over here as well as over here. In order to do that, we have to lift the state up for it to live within my app. Now, that's all very well and good, but when I pass that property or the state of that property down to level 3, in order to get it there, I have to traverse through level 1 and level 2 and level 3, which means that that data has to be updated within these two classes, which doesn't actually need it. So I have to essentially drill down through my tree in order to be able to reach the lower levels. And in reactive programming, this is something that we might call prop drilling. So drilling through the tree in order to pass down the property. Let's see this in action in our code. Let's say that we have our string, which is just called data, and it's, I don't know, a top secret data. And this needs to be used within both the app bar here. So it's going to be used inside the title as a text widget, and that is going to contain that data. But it also needs to be used down here in level 3. So this level 3 text widget also needs data. But in order to get it down into level 3, I need to drill through all my levels. So it means that inside level 1, I'll need a property, which I'll just call data. And when I initialize level 1, I'm going to initialize it by passing over this data property. And then I'm going to pass it over to level 1 through its constructor. And then now that data is inside level 1. But in order to get it down to level 3, I have to keep passing it to level 2, right? So let's pass it over to level 2 and let's create that final string property, which we call data. And then when level 2 gets initialized, we also pass over the property to this .data. And then finally, we just need to pass it over to level 3. So again, I'm going to create my final string data. And when I initialize level 3, then I pass over the value of the data that I need. And now finally, I have the data where I need it, down in level 3, so that I can actually put it inside my text widget. So now if I hit save and I run my app, then you can see that it works, right? My data, which lives inside my app, my top level widget, is able to pass this data property both down to my app bar as well as to my level 3 widget, which is this one that has the text widget. But in order to do that, I had to pass that data through a whole bunch of unrelated and really widgets that didn't care for this data at all. Because you can see that in level 2, I don't need that data. In level 1, I don't need that data. I'm just passing this data through in order to get it down to level 3. So for any lazy programmers out there, this is pretty painful to watch. And it also massively increases the complexity. Say I don't know, have a typo in here, or say I had some sort of other piece of data inside level 1 and I get confused between the data that gets passed in and the local version of it. It's really not pretty. So what can we do instead? Well, if we had the provider package, well then we could move the state up to the top, but then we can have widgets that simply subscribe to the state. So we might have our level 3 widget put its hand up saying, I'm going to listen for any changes in the state. And when it does change, I'll be notified. And instead of traversing through level 1 and level 2 in order to get to level 3, it simply only passes the data to the level 3 widget, which actually cares for this updated state, instead of rebuilding level 1, level 2, and level 3. Instead of having that tree rebuild to pass the state down so that we actually get it to level 3, we simply just let level 3 listen to updates. So how can we use Provider to get all of these cool features? Well, we first have to include the Provider package in our app. So let's head over to installing and let's add Provider as a dependency. So I'm going to open up my pubspec.yaml, and just below my Cupertino icons, where all my dependencies go, I'm going to add the Provider package, and I'm going to call packages get to fetch the code from that package. And now I should be able to import the provider.dart file. So now that I've got Provider in my code, I'm able to use it. The first thing I have to do is to expose my data So to say, what is the data that we're going to be providing? In order to do that, it's, as you can imagine, and we're in Flutterland, so it's going to be achieved using a widget. And I'm going to put that provider as high up as it needs be. Given that I need the data both in my app bar as well as all the way down in level 3, well then I'm going to put it at the very top so that my data is provided to my entire Material app. So here I'm going to wrap with a new widget, and that widget is going to be a provider widget. Now, with the provider widget, we also have to specify a data type of the kind of data that this provider is going to provide. That data type is just going to be a string because our data is just a really simple string, right? So now that I've created my provider widget and it has a child, which all subsequent levels are going to be able to listen to the data that I provide, we also have to add one more property, which is the provider builder. So the builder takes the current build context so that it knows where it is within the widget tree, and then it has to return the data that needs to be available to all the children. That is going to be our data right here. Now that I've got my data being provided at the very top level of the tree, then I can ask the provider to give me that data wherever I need it. So firstly, let's simplify this code. We have a simple one-line return, so we don't need all of this curly brackets, etc., and the return keyword. We can simply just use our fat arrow. It does exactly the same thing. So now we are providing our data at the very top level of our app, above our Material app, so we can now reach into it and use it wherever we need to. The first place where we need it is within our text. So now, instead of having to pass our data through our level 1, level 2 widgets, which really don't need this data, we can actually go ahead and delete all of this code, all of it here and here and here, and instead we're just going to be using it within level 3. And in order to access that data, all we have to do is say provider.of, and again, the of method expects us to specify what kind of data we're trying to get hold of. So this is going to be the string that we're providing right here to all of the children in our tree. So now if I hit save and I check my app, you can see that I'm still getting my top secret data being passed all the way down to my level 3 stateless widget. And that comes from right here. As you can see, let's say I decide to change this data to, I don't know, let's say a top secret code. And now if I rerun my app, you can see that data is actually being passed over to level 3 without needing to drill through level 1 and level 2. Now, that's all very well and good. We were able to provide our data at the very top level, and then we were able to read the data all the way down here without needing to go through any of the in-between parts in our tree. So now when the state of that property changes up here, because level 3 is listening to those changes, well, it can receive it immediately and rebuild itself without needing to rebuild level 1 or level 2. So faster, more efficient code. Now, let's make this a little bit more complex, because at the moment, all that we're doing with provider is we're providing and we're reading. What if we also had to update the state from somewhere down within our tree? So let's update our simple app to still have level 1, 2, 3, but now we also have a text widget over here called myText in a separate class. And we also have a myText field widget down here. That's a child of level 2. So the idea is, how can we get an update that happens down here all the way over to myText, which is higher up in the tree, and also in level 3 using the Power Provider? So here I have my separate class, my text, and the other class, which is my text field, and I'm going to slot them into my tree. So my text is going to go as the text widget here in the app bar. So let's change that to my text. And then my text field is going to be a child of my level 2 widget. So instead of this empty container here, I'm going to add my text field right here. So now we basically have this exact structure of widget tree. And I have to be able to get this data all the way over here as well as over here without needing to rebuild any of the intervening widgets. So how do we do this? Well, we need the use of a class called a change notifier. So let's create another class here, which is going to be our data class, and make this data class extend the change notifier class. Now, this change notifier class actually comes from Flutter itself. This is not something that came with Provider. It already exists. And it exists for the purpose of notifying listeners to this particular class of any updates in the class. So let's move our data down into our data class. And instead of having it being final, well, we need to be able to change it, right? We want to be able to make updates to our data. So let's start it off with just some dummy data. Let's call it some data. And let's start providing this data object instead of just the simple string that we had from before. So instead of returning data, which now no longer exists, we're going to return an object of the data class. And this object is going to no longer be using a normal provider, which just provides a string data type. Well, instead, it's going to be a change notifier provider. And it's going to be providing a data type. So now, in order to get access to our data right here, we will still use our provider.of, and instead of using the string data type, we actually have to provide the data type that we want to provide, which is data. And instead of providing this entire object, this data object that gets created from the class, we're going to be providing the data object's data property, because that is the thing that is a string. And that string is then going to be put into our text widget and be displayed. So now I can also copy that and put it into the My Text widget as well, so that it's rendered in my app bar as well as my level 3 text widget. So let's first run our app and check to make sure that we're actually able to both provide our data as well as read our data in both the My Text widget in the app bar as well as the text widget in level 3. So that's working pretty well. So now we have to achieve our next goal, which is to update the data. And we're going to update it within my text field. So we all know that my text field has a property called onChanged, which takes a callback that has access to the new value or the new text that gets typed into the text field. And we now need to be able to move this text into our data class to update this string. So let's create a method inside our data class. Let's create a void method so it doesn't return anything, and it's going to change our string. So it's the change string method, and we'll pass in a new string, which is going to take the place of our data, and I'm going to set the data to equal the new string. And then, most crucially, I'm going to use a method that's available to us because we are inheriting from the change notifier. And that method is the notify listeners method. So what this does is, as soon as we update our data to the new value, we call notify listeners so that everybody who's listening to our provider can rebuild their widgets as well, because they're notified of that state change. So now, if inside our onChanged, we tap into our provider.of and we specify the type of data we're interested in, which is our data class. Well, then we can tap into that method called change string. And we're going to pass in the new text as the new string that's going to be put into this data property. So now if we rerun our app and I go into here and I start typing, then you can see that all the listeners to this data, namely the My Text widget and the text widget in level 3, well, they're going to be rebuilding because the state is now updating every time I change the text in my text field. So let's just review the code once more. So I created this class called data, which extends something called a change notifier that allows pieces of the data inside this class to notify any listeners which are trying to track the state of a piece of data, namely this property called data. And that property is being read both inside this text widget in the app bar as well as this text widget inside level 3. So the appearance of these two text widgets are tied to the state of this data property. And when that data property updates, then this text widget is going to rebuild itself to reflect that change. Now, that data property comes from right here, and we update it inside our change string method, where we pass in a new string to replace the old string inside the data property. And then, and crucially, we call notify listeners so that everybody who's listening to that data property gets notified and they can rebuild themselves to update the latest state. Now, because we need to call this notify listeners, this is also why we can't just simply tap into provider of data, which we know is basically this data object, and simply tap into that data property and set it equal to the new text. Because in this case, when we're just updating this string from the outside, we're not actually calling notify listeners. We're just updating this property's value. So we must use a method to change the string so that we actually call notify listeners. Now, another important thing to remember is that this provider.of method actually has an optional parameter called listen. So let's say that my text, which is the text widget inside the app bar, well, let's say that we don't actually want it to update with every single update of my text field. Let's say that we want it to get the original value of the data that's stored, but we don't want it to listen for updates. We don't want it to rebuild every time this data changes. Well, then all we have to do is to add the listen property and we can set it to false. Now, by default, this property is set to true, which is why every time you use provider.of, you're getting a listener which is going to update itself based on changes in that thing that you're listening for. But now that we've set listen to false, let's rerun our app, and you can see that both text properties start out with some data, which comes from here. When data gets initialized, that's going to be the value of data. But when I start typing in the text field, because my text widget, this one here, is not listening to the changes, it doesn't update and it doesn't redraw. So this gives you quite a fine granular control over what are the things where you want to listen for updates to the data and redraw, and what are the things where you just want an initial value of the data and to never change again, even if it changes. Now that you've seen the provider package in action, you might be wondering to yourself, well, how exactly does it work? So in order to understand it, let's pop open the hood and see what's going on behind the scenes. Out of all of these different ways of managing state, there is one where we use an inherited widget. Now, an inherited widget is basically a widget that allows us to pass data down the tree without having to rebuild the intervening parts of the tree. So that sounds kind of familiar, right? That's kind of how Provider works. Essentially, the Provider package is just a wrapper around the inherited widget. But because the inherit widget class has some specific requirements in order to construct it, and you have to construct it in a certain way that ensures that it's still being efficient and it's running as expected. So there's quite a bit of boilerplate code, and you have to be quite mindful of how it works when you're using it. So I recommend taking a look at the inherited widget class and having a listen through the explanation of this widget by Philip with his very cool Google Bicycle shirt, and learning a little bit more about how it actually works behind the scenes. Because essentially our Provider package is just leveraging the power of this class, but it's doing it in a way that makes it easier to work with it and to force you to use it in a safe and effective way. And once you're done with that, I recommend you to build your very own version of this widget tree. So have separate classes. Well, in this case, I've got about 6 different classes which are organized in this way, and to use the Provider package yourself to see how you can provide data at the very top level, how you can read data at a lower level, and to update data using the Change Notifier provider. So have a play around with that, and if you want to see the code that we've been using in this lesson, then you'll be able to download it in the course resources too. But in the next lesson, we're actually going to plug in Provider into our actual Todoist app and see it in a much more complex and more real life scenario. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.